One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. We welcome both Mark Staker and Joseph Dorowski to the Mormon Channel studio and are grateful you could spend some time with us. Of course, we're welcoming Mark back, who's appeared on Legacy previously, discussing details of both Harmony in Episode 6 and, more recently, Kirtland in Episode 25. Mark, we're glad you're back.
Thank you.
Joseph, on the other hand, is here for his first Legacy experience. Joe has been with the Joseph Smith Papers Project since 2002. And serves as a co-editor of Volume 4 of the document series. He holds a B.S. from Cornell, an M.A. in history from Brigham Young University, and has done additional graduate work at the College of William and Mary. Additionally, he earned a diploma from the Institute for the Editing of Historical Documents at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Joe, we're glad you could be here with us.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about organization in the early church today, and I'd like to start off by discussing two words, conference and council, and what they may have to do with that early organization.
Yeah, it's very interesting in the early church because a number of things aren't in place yet that we're very familiar with today, particularly in the organizational structure of the church. When the church is organized in April of 1830, the directions that are given at that time specify that there's a first and second elder, Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and that the elders of the church are to meet periodically in conference. There's several versions of that initial document we call the Articles and Covenants of the Church. One iteration of it just says that they're to meet as needed to conduct the business of the church. Another says every 3 months. As it turned out, they did a combination of the two. There were quarterly conferences held in 1830, 31, 1832, but they also held a number of special conferences. But the basic idea was that these were to be meetings where the business of the church, whatever that might be, callings to the priesthood, ordinations, assignments for missions, and so on, and discussions of how various issues that were affecting the church at that time would be handled, such as the need for publication, printing, the establishment of a printing organization, the need to raise funds to support Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, and others in their church responsibilities. All of these were going to be handled what initially were called conferences. And these were meetings where a number of the elders, whoever were available at that time, would gather. They would have testimony bearing, they'd have preaching and so on, and then they'd make decisions, reach resolutions about this. The early revelations assign the responsibility for chairing or governing these conferences to Joseph Smith. And he is also designated as the prophet, seer, and revelator of the church. And very early on, it's indicated that he'll be the only one who receives the revelation for the church, that is to direct the work of the church and also to provide additional doctrinal understanding. So we don't have a presidency yet, and we don't have the kind of councils at the head of the church that we're familiar with later on. And this situation is the way in which the church is looked after for over a year. In October of 1831, Joseph Smith gives some additional instruction. And at that time, he goes back to the Articles and Covenants, and he tells the elders that, look, in here it says that we're to meet in these conferences and we conduct the business of the church, but it's as we're guided by the Spirit. And that's the language that's in the Articles and Covenants. He says, I want to tell you some more about that. I want to tell you what the ancient order was for conducting essentially councils where we would meet and counsel together and make decisions for the church. And he subsequently is able to elaborate on that a little bit in October of 1831. And almost immediately, the tone of these conferences takes on a little different nature. And as you read through the minutes, various minutes that relate, particularly for November 1831, but the subsequent minutes as well, we begin to get language like the conference seeking to know the mind and will of the Lord on this matter has now decided that we'll do such and such, or the conference resolves that we will do this. There's a number of revelations that are related to this that are very important, and maybe we'll go into some of those as we proceed this morning. But this sense that conferences are revelatory experiences, not in terms of getting doctrinal revelation or the direction of where the church is to turn, but in handling the business of the church, that this body is entitled to revelatory guidance, is better understood at that time. And this continues on for a number of months, and finally in 1834, in the winter of 1834, we reach a point where the High Council of the Church, the first High Council of the Church, is organized. And it's on the basis, and this becomes a body that's known as a council. So we have a transition that goes from these quarterly conferences. Eventually, as a body is established, a standing group of individuals is established to be involved in church governance, becomes known as a council. So that's our transition in there. As I say, there's a number of steps that take place in there that are very interesting.
Were regular members of the church part of these conferences like we're accustomed to today, or?
Yes, the conferences, yes. Members were in attendance, and men and women. It's just that there weren't a lot of members of the church at the time, so at any given time, we don't have huge numbers. You wouldn't have thousands gathered because you didn't have thousands to gather yet. But they were open to the members of the church. The guiding principle was common consent, which we're used to. Mark, you might want to comment on the meaning of common consent, because it is a little different than we might sometimes think.
The word conference actually was already familiar to them because it was used by other Christian denominations, and so they adopted a pattern that was already in place, but they used it a little bit differently. You had some conferences where all the membership, or as many of the members wanted to attend as cared to, or could attend that wanted to, and we're familiar with that today with general conferences. But you also have priesthood conferences. Sometimes they say conference when it's a very limited group of members who hold specific priesthood office, who approve publications and other things that act in an official manner. And common consent was also one of the things that took place in these conferences, where this practice dates back to at least the Middle Ages, where a group of individuals would agree together to be bound by certain laws or certain requirements. And we see that today in sustaining individuals to serve in the church in various positions, where everyone who's a member of that congregation approves that action. And that also took place in a number of these conferences, where business of the church was carried out, and sometimes publications were approved by a certain body by common consent. And so that was also one of the things that took place in these conferences.
Joe, you made reference to a document called the Articles and Covenants. Can you give us a background on that to some people who, like me, who may not have been as aware?
Yeah, we're probably most familiar with it as our current Doctrine and Covenants, Section 20. But at the time, it was the document that was the basis for church governance. It laid out what the church was to be, and how elders in the church were to function, and teachers and priests, what their duties were, and how they were to conduct themselves. So it was a document that was often referred to by members at that time, particularly those who would hold the priesthood as they went about their duties. This was kind of like their handbook, their guidance, and how they were going to handle different situations, what their authority was, and so on. So it was a very important document in the early church. We date it to April 10th, a little bit after the meeting that organized the church on April 6th. Prior to this, Oliver Cowdery drafted a document in 1829 where he used the Book of Mormon and a little bit of what was known at that time about what was going to unfold from some of the very early revelations, the pre-1830 revelations. And he composed a document that is kind of the predecessor to what we have in Doctrine and Covenants 20. And that document built on that and actually expanded it, added some additional information and counsel and guidance. So it was the fundamental articles of the church when the church began to guide the leadership of the church.
Just its name reminds me of the Articles of Faith. Is there any connection or?
Not a direct connection. Articles of Faith are presented later on in response to questions about, so what is it that Mormons believe? And that was an attempt. There were a number of attempts to kind of articulate what the fundamental beliefs of the church were, and the most famous was drafted in response to a letter by a publisher who wanted some information for an upcoming publication, and Joseph Smith authorized that, and that's our present-day Articles of Faith as we understand it.
So perhaps other than time, the difference would be internal versus external, some
certainly
teaching principles.
Yeah. The Articles and Covenants would have been known to the members, not so well known outside of the membership of the church, and essentially used by the members as guidelines, again, as they went about their various responsibilities. The wording that we have today is simply reflects some refinements that took place over time. As the church grew and priesthood offices were added that weren't initially available, and as some organizational structure was added, revelations would be revised to reflect those changes, and that was understood at that time as a natural part of the growth of the church.
So let's go more into the evolution of how things began to change as far as the first presidency, the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood, and how it all came about.
Well, I can give you a timeline for the role of conferences and councils, and then maybe, Mark, you could overlay that with how the presidency came into play. So if we go back to April 1830, we have elders leading the church. And I think it's important to understand that when they used a term like elders then, they may not be using it exactly the same way we do today. That as more revelations came forward and as the church expanded and understanding of the priesthood expanded, the understanding of what an elder was transformed over time. I think one of the things that may have happened with the very early church is alluded to in the first section of the Doctrine and Covenants, which was given in 1831, November of 1831, to be the preface for what initially was going to be a collection of the revelations called the Book of Commandments. Because of the mobbing in Missouri, the Book of Commandments, though we have remnants of it, was never formally published. 1835, what is published we have is the Doctrine and Covenants. But in the first section, this preface, one of the things that's stated in there, I think it's in the 24th verse, is that these commandments are from the Lord, but he's giving them to his servants in their language and according to their understanding. And so we have a number of instances in the early church where I think the Lord uses terminology that the members were familiar with. So when he begins with elders, they have an idea of what an elder is because other churches have elders. And then in the Revelations, it's kind of like saying, okay, you guys understand what an elder is. Let's begin there. Now we're going to do some things a little differently, and here's how we're going to do it. But you get a basic concept. I think the same thing happens when the School of the Prophets is introduced. Well, schools of the prophets were understood to be those places where ministers were trained. Yale and Harvard were called schools of the prophets. So when the Lord introduces that concept and says we're going to have a school of the prophets, you could think that the early members had an idea of what that was. Okay, that's where we're going to train our ministers. And then you get additional instructions. Says, now this is how we're going to do it. It's going to be a little different. So you see that, particularly in the early church, the use of the term conference, because it was something that we're familiar with, is a logical thing to call these initial gatherings and business meetings. So in any event, going back to April 1830, we start with elders governing the church, and Joseph Smith as the first elder presiding, and meeting together in what we're going to call conferences. And these aren't organized bodies in the sense that the same people are going to show up every time. Okay. Then Joseph gives a little more instruction about how they're supposed to conduct themselves. But in the interim, the high priesthood is introduced. And initially, not a lot of instruction is given about what the high priesthood is, other than it has certain authority for sealing and some other things. But in November of 1831, instructions given about how the high priesthood really is to govern the church, and not just the high priesthood, but there's to be a new office that they hadn't had yet, the president of the high priesthood of the church. And the president of the high priesthood of the church is to select 12 other high priests to serve with him when handling important church business, to form a council. It's very interesting. It's not a high council yet, and the 12 high priests aren't a standing council yet, but that idea is introduced. Then in February of 1834, the High Council itself is organized, and it's organized in Kirtland, Ohio. Joseph Smith is there. It becomes, in effect, the High Council of the church. It becomes the governing council over the church. And now you have individuals assigned to that council who are now a standing body. And so we've moved from this conference model of handling church business to something a little bit more formal, a little bit more explicit, having specific people as part of that council on an ongoing basis, and that becomes the governing council of the church at that time, the presidents of the church and these 12 individuals. And then from that, we move on to the addition of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, the organization of the 70. And by the time we get to the dedication of the Kirtland Temple in 1836, most of the offices and most of the structure of the church is in place. And at that dedication of the Kirtland Temple at that time, they sustained some officers. And if you look at the sustaining, I think most of us would be very familiar with what you see there. There would be the presidents of the church, there would be the 12 apostles, the 70, there would be high councils being sustained, and then the priesthood organizations, high priests, 70s, elders, priests, teachers, deacons, bishops, and so on. But that's a gradual process that takes place over 5 years to reach the point where we have that, and where we have it in a structure that we're familiar with, which is the council structure that we still follow in the church today.
In fact, we used to refer to the Quorum of the 12 as the Council of the 12 quite often.
Well, the first responsibility of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles was to be a traveling high council. They were not given any jurisdiction where a stake of the church existed, but they were responsible outside of those areas and for the missionary work of the church at that time. So they were, in terms of their duties, they were a high council, in effect, and they were equal in authority to the High Council in Kirtland, the High Council in Zion. And if you read parts of D&C 107, it talks about how these high councils were of equal rank. And at that point in time, the duties of the 12 were, I guess we'd say, a little bit more circumscribed than they became. Again, there was a process of unfolding there as well.
Good. And these councils rose in conjunction with another body of administration, the First Presidency, that operates today, of course, with the Council, the 12 Apostles. But when John the Baptist first met with Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, he gave them instructions, and we don't know what they said, but one of the things that Oliver mentioned that he learned at that time was that he would be called into a presidency to govern the church. And it appears to be conditional in his case based on his behavior. But as Joe has mentioned, when the church was organized, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were set apart as the first and second elders to govern the church. And shortly after that, Oliver began challenging some of the revelations, wanting to correct them, and receiving revelations from other sources, particularly Hiram Page, who was another follower of Joseph Smith. And the Lord clarified that only Joseph Smith could receive revelations for the church. And from the very beginning, Joseph seems to have had a unique title. He was called Joseph the Seer in a number of documents. And Section 21 of the Doctrine and Covenants expanded that title, where the Lord says, "Thou shalt be called a seer, a translator, a prophet, an apostle of Jesus Christ." And Joseph Smith seems to, from very early on, to have received a unique role in the church. But it wasn't the way we understand it today in terms of the prophet being the head of the church, although he was recognized as being the revelator, the only one authorized to receive revelation. What is interesting is when he arrives in Kirtland, Ohio, he receives a revelation that calls Edward Partridge to be the bishop of the church. And Edward Partridge seems to have understood that this gave him authority over the whole church, to the extent that he actually had authority over Joseph Smith as well. And and the details of this are not clear because we don't have enough documentation to understand everything that took place, but he apparently began to dictate to Joseph and hold authority over him, or what he perceived as authority over him. And it wasn't until the fall of 1831 that Joseph received a revelation that put him in the position of the president of the high priesthood. And that's the first time we get the word president used in the church. And Joseph has that position. And also in that same revelation, it's clarified that the bishop will not have authority over him, that the president has authority over the bishop and over the other priesthood quorums as well. And so Joseph Smith holds that position uniquely, that he is the sole president of the church. And it's not until the following January of 1832 that Joseph Smith is actually ordained as president of the high priesthood, and that's when he gains the position of president of the church. I mean, he has that position solely. He has no assistants or counselors or others initially, and it's not until a few months later that two other individuals, Jesse Gause and Sidney Rigdon, are called to be his counselors. But they're counselors to the first presidency, or counselors to the presidency, and not counselors in the presidency. And those who've looked at their lives and this period of history have often assumed that this was the beginning of three men leading the church, but that's not the case. It looks like from the historical record that Joseph Smith retained the sole office of president of the high priesthood, and these counselors played a supporting role as his scribes, but were not part of the presidency themselves. And Jesse Gause leaves the church shortly after this, and Frederick G. Williams is called to be a counselor along with Sidney Rigdon. But again, they are counselors to Joseph Smith, and they serve a clerking function or as his scribes. And it's not until the following year that the Lord in Revelation actually directs that Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams are to be called as presidents and given keys of authority. And it's at that point in 1833 that we get what begins to be the first presidency as we understand it today. And they saw that what they were doing was following a similar pattern to the New Testament, where you had Peter, James, and John as holding a specific type of authority, and that they were following that same pattern. And so Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams then all share specific keys of authority. And Joseph even says that when he is not there, that these other men can act independently or together without him, and that they can also provide direction for the church. And so this develops a new kind of authority in the church.
When did the term First Presidency actually come into use?
The term First Presidency doesn't come into use until 1835, when Oliver Cowdery is going back and editing an earlier revelation that talks about Joseph and the council, again, of the high priesthood that would appoint bishops. For example, Oliver Cowdery goes back and changes that wording and uses First Presidency. And that's the first time it appears in a revelatory document. It also appears in that same year in the Messenger and Advocate, a church publication, a newspaper that was printed in Kirtland. And so it's not until that point that they actually begin using the word, but the office has already been in place for more than a year and a half by then.
So you made the connection between the First Presidency and Peter, James, and John. When did the brethren of the early church make that connection?
It's not really clear what instructions they received, Joseph and Oliver received, when they were given priesthood authority from Peter, James, and John, and they may have understood some of that early. But the connection's not made in the documents until much later. In 1834, they first start talking about that in the documents and about Peter, James, and John being a pattern.
When the High Council's organized in February 1834, there's some discussion of what the ancient order was. Joseph Smith teaches about that. He teaches about a week before they organized the High Council. He teaches a little bit about that principle, and then he teaches again when they formally organized the High Council. So there's some unfolding there in that regard. And at that point, because of the earlier revelations authorizing Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams to have keys of authority in the church, they understand that there is a three-person presidency, and that's specified in the discussions of the High Council. And the meetings that organize the High Council then become the document that Joseph Smith creates out of those meetings and is sustained in those meetings. They refer to as the Constitution of the High Council. And so at that point, you do have a presidency that we would recognize as the first presidency, even though they weren't using the terminology. And you do have a presiding council. You have two presiding councils in the church, the presidency and now the newly organized High Council. And you have to keep in mind, this is before there's a formal organization of a quorum of 12 apostles and so on. And when the first High Council is organized, that is the only High Council in the church. So in effect, it not only presides in Kirtland, which is understood to be a stake of Zion, but it presides over the church as a governing body. That summer, after Zion's camp has arrived in Missouri, a council is organized in Missouri as well, and that becomes the presiding council for the church in Zion or the church in the Missouri area. And so then we have our second High Council. what they had anticipated was that ultimately Jackson County would be returned to the church. Zion would be redeemed in the terminology they used at the time. And Zion would be the governing place of the church. Joseph Smith would be there. And so the High Council that would be situated in Jackson County at Zion in the New Jerusalem would be the governing High Council of the church. And that each of the stakes as they were formed would have a presiding High Council that in turn would answer to the governing High Council. But in 1834, because of the disruption after the mobbing and exodus out of Jackson County, Kirtland actually is the seat of government of the church. And the High Council in Kirtland for that season is the presiding High Council of the church. And you can see some interesting things unfold up through 1837. While Joseph Smith is in Kirtland, that council functions as the presiding council. When Joseph Smith leaves Kirtland in January of 1838 and relocates to Missouri, the High Council at Far West, in effect, becomes the presiding High Council of the church. The High Council in Kirtland continues to function, but it functions as a stake High Council.
I'm reminded of Moses when he was counseling with his father-in-law, when he was judging the people, draining himself, using every extra moment of every day. And Jethro said, "You're going to kill yourself unless you get some help." Is that sort of how Joseph felt when he decided on counselors, or was it more revelation?
It's actually specified in the Revelation.
Exactly.
There's a couple of instances prior to November of 1831 where Joseph is referred to as a Moses to the church. But when you get to the Revelation that organizes the concept of presidents in the church, it's very specific that the president of the high priesthood of the church is like Moses to the church. And yet immediately that president is given a council to assist him, or a court. Sometimes it's referred to as a court, sometimes as the council of the president of the high priesthood of the church. 12 high priests who are supposed to assist in rendering these decisions. So I think from the very outset of the introduction of the concept of a president, and that concept of president is linked to Moses, the idea of a Moses as a revelator, but also as at the head of the church, immediately help assistance is given in the form of these individuals who are supposed to assist in rendering those decisions.
I find it interesting that, at least from a worldly perspective, we tend to want to consolidate authority. We want to have more control over things. And in Joseph's case, he seems to be moving towards sharing authority with others. It's not always easier to operate as a council. And in Moses' case, some of what he was doing was helping to save his time because he had so much on his plate. Some of what Joseph did actually took more time to be able to work as a council rather than to just operate as an individual. But he's sharing authority with other people. And we see that from the very beginning, while he's still working on the Book of Mormon translation, for example. He seeks to help Oliver Cowdery learn to translate as well. In Oliver's case, it doesn't work well, and he ends up giving up trying, at least initially. But Joseph is trying to bring other people along to do the same things that he's doing. He's not trying to consolidate authority in himself as much as he is sharing that authority with others. And so I think that councils and the First Presidency in particular help him do that because they give other people the same kinds of authority that he has.
And by doing that, it kind of mentors those around him and prepares them for later leadership position, sounds like.
Yes, exactly.
And part of this, of course, is the growth of the church is really requiring some of this decentralization, if you want to use, our term for it, to take place. But part of it also reflects an underlying goal that Joseph Smith has, which is to create a Zion society. And so in a Zion society, as it was understood then, you had to be of one heart and one mind. You had to have no poor among you, and you had to be able to have the Lord walk with you. And you can take that as maybe a figurative expression, but at that time, many of the members took it as a literal expression. And Joseph Smith, in trying to seek to build a Zion society, really was seeking to elevate everyone in the church to the same level. He wanted them to have the same economic advantages. So in the early church, there's this constant effort to organize a way to take care of the poor of the church and provide for them, and at the same time provide for the needs of the church itself as an institution, as a temporal institution, as a going concern, so to speak. There's a need to elevate the educational level of all the members, and so schools are instituted and so on. There's this desire on Joseph's part to spiritually allow the members to have the same kind of experiences as he has had. And you see kind of a fulfillment of at least the initial effort to do that in when the Kirtland Temple's dedicated, some of the very powerful feeling the Spirit or having visions or speaking in tongues and things of this sort that went on. And so this is a part of what Joseph Smith, well, it's not a part of, it is the program that Joseph Smith was trying to institute, was to create a Zion society. So as part of that, even though there had to be leadership at the head to guide and direct, he worked very hard, very deliberately to share authority, to share responsibilities, and to essentially elevate those that he was with. You see this in some of the early councils, or the conferences that begin to become councils, where he teaches this principle that when they're in these meetings, they're to be led by the Spirit, and in conducting the business of the church, making decisions of not what the church is and not the direction it's to move in, but functionally, how are they to operate, who is to go where, who is to take what assignment, and so on. That body of priesthood in a conference or in a council, we're entitled to revelation about how to do that. And Joseph and Oliver, in these early meetings, answer to those conferences and councils when direction is given. A resolution will be passed that we would like Oliver to organize this, say the revelations, and Oliver will go and do that as requested by the conference or council and so on. Joseph is asked to meet with certain people or conduct certain business in these conferences, and he submits himself to that conference or council and abides by the direction that's given there. We have a revelation that was given, I think it's November 1st of 1833. Orson Hyde and several other individuals had been just called as high priests, and they're going to go off on a mission. It's our current section, Doctrine and Covenants, section 68. But at the beginning of it, there's a preface to it that says that these individuals have come and asked to know the mind and will of the Lord about how they should conduct themselves. And in that revelation, it says, and these are individuals, and these are very young guys, and they've just been called as high priests. While you're on your mission and while you're doing this work, when you're moved upon by the Spirit, that will be the mind of the Lord and the will of the Lord. You'll speak what the Lord would have spoken. That's such a powerful concept, because here's Joseph Smith at the head of the church, clearly being designated as a Moses and to be the prophet, seer, and revelator to the church, and the final authority on the issues before the church. And at the same time, he's providing a revelation. He sought for and provided a revelation to these brethren, which essentially says, you too can receive revelation and speak for the Lord. Now, it's contingent on the calling that you have and the duties that you have, and it's circumscribed in terms of the specific things that you're involved in, but you're entitled to revelation and inspiration. And that would have had to have been an incredible thing to teach a group of young men who are just beginning to have some important experiences, spiritual experiences in their life, that they can go out there and they can teach with the power and authority of God.
Ultimately, what this pattern does, or what Joseph's teaching does, is sets a pattern so that after he is martyred, the 12 apostles are able to follow this identical pattern in reestablishing the first presidency of the church in the fall in December of 1847. They look at what has been done before, and they continue on the same pattern that they have already learned through Joseph Smith. But they argue that they have the same keys that Joseph Smith had. They have the same authority, and that they can continue to perpetuate this pattern. And so we find it in the church today. It's continued on after Joseph's death because he established a pattern that we can follow today in governing the church.
Has the first presidency evolved in any ways since from then to now?
Well, Joseph Smith also introduced the office of assistant counselors, and he had others who played roles in the first presidency from time to time. And depending on different presidents of the church, they've also had assistant counselors and others who have helped the first presidency in various ways. But the pattern remains the same as Joseph established it.
I remember when President Hinckley was called as the third counselor in the first presidency, and that was, for me, such a foreign concept, but it seemed to make sense and was well accepted, I guess.
Well, when you look at, say, 1836, at the time of the dedication of the House of the Lord in Kirtland, there's 9 presidents of the church present. It's Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, Frederick G. Williams, Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith Sr., and then from Missouri, David and John Whitmer and W.W. Phelps. All are addressed as presidents. And there's a couple of meetings that they hold together early in 1836. We have a record of them in Joseph Smith's journal. I think in one instance they're called a Grand Council. A number of other cases they're called a High Council of the Church. The term being used a little bit differently than in reference to the standing body of 12 high counselors. But they're all identified and respected as presidents of the church. So it's a little bit different in that respect. Now, that situation doesn't persist indefinitely, but it's, I guess, because it was a point of transition, there were some elements of it that were just managed a little bit differently than we would today. One of the issues that they constantly had to face was communications. You didn't have rapid communication. It was roughly 1,000 miles between Kirtland, Ohio, and Jackson County, Missouri, and 3 or 4 week for a letter or a messenger to cover that distance, and so on. And so you did have a need for this broader structure, I guess, than we utilize today, but also in the leadership of the church, you have a quorum of the 12 apostles that sit with the presidency of the church to govern the church. So you have those standing councils. You have the 70s extensively organized, area authorities, and so on. So we have a number of things they did not have and didn't envision at that time. They essentially accomplished the same thing. It allows there to be authority in the church where it needs to be, and the church to be effectively governed.
What can I and listeners take away from this process, that has evolved?
That Joseph Smith established a pattern that continues in the church today, that we have specific bodies of authority that continue to govern in the church that are based on ancient patterns that continued or that were existed in the early church and that were part of the early restored church as well.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Joseph Smith was very sensitive in terms of restoration to restoring what he referred to as the ancient order, and he hearkened back to the apostles of the New Testament time. He looked at the Book of Mormon and the things that were revealed in there. He looked to the Old Testament. And so he tried to build on that foundation and saw what he was doing as a continuation of that. And though the church started out with a structure that's a little bit different than we're familiar with, it was essentially because there was a teaching process and an unfolding going on. The size of the church was small, so the needs were a little bit differently. And the early leadership of the church had to be taught line upon line, and these things unfolded. Now, they unfolded incredibly quickly to a point where we would be, fairly comfortable recognizing what's going on. So if you go from 1830 to 1836, in that short span of time, most of what we're familiar with in the church, and many, many of the revelations, maybe about 100 of the revelations that we have canonized or so, were in place. Not everything was in place. The role of the Quorum of the 12 would be a little further defined before Joseph's martyrdom, and some adjustments of that nature would take place. But in a fairly short period of time, this was unfolded in a way, again, that we would be familiar with. And then from there, on that basis, as the needs of the church shifted over time, the demands, that structure had the flexibility to be adjusted and to be modified to meet the demands that the church faces. And I think we need to see the church as a work in progress. We're not finished yet. There's more to come, and there's more to be unfolded. That's the history of the church. And, we only look at a very small time span, but you could look at the whole span of the existence of the restored church and see that there's this constant refinement and revision as needed to the structure and organization of the church to accommodate the needs. Particularly, we're going through a period, again, of rapid growth, and we can see a number of things being done. And there's more to be done, and that's how the Lord designed it, and that's how it was carried out, and that's how Joseph Smith, I think, understood it, and all of the presidents of the church that have followed him.
And I think the revision of the quorums of the 70 is a great example of what you're talking about, depending on how the church has grown recently. Anything else you would like to add to this discussion today?
Mark?
I think most members of the church have served on a council at some point in their church service because they play such an important role in the church. And I think that for me, as I do so, it is nice to think back on those early members of the church who were struggling to figure out how these councils should operate, and we continue to do that today. We try, how we implement councils changes constantly, depending on the needs that we have as a church, and depending on the revelations that our authorities receive on our behalf. But to me, it is comforting to know that this is part of the divine pattern, and that what we are doing is part of the restored gospel.
I think in terms of councils, we can recognize that councils were the organizing principle of the church from the very beginning. And we teach that principle now. But it goes back to the very foundations of the church from April 10th with our current Doctrine and Covenants, Section 20 there, Articles and Covenants of the Church. Onward, councils were the governing principle. Now, they may have called them conferences at first and so on, and there's this unfolding process, but it's essentially leadership of the church through a council structure. And you have this symbiotic relationship between those who hold the office of presidency in some capacity and those who serve in the larger council structure in terms of all being eligible for revelation, the president being the one who receives the revelation for the body as a whole, but all members of that being able to receive revelatory guidance in conducting the business that council is responsible for. And I think it's a powerful witness to that principle as it continues on in the church, that it was there at the very inception, and it's continued on to this day. I think another aspect of this, because of the nature of the discussion that we're having that's focused on the very, very early beginnings of the church is that it's hard for us sometimes to project ourselves back to a time when they didn't know what we know. We know an awful lot more than they knew in 1830, 1831, 1832, 1834 when the High Council was first being organized and so on. And so as we look at some of these things, sometimes it's helpful to try and put on blinders and block out what came next and just try to deal with where they were and what they knew. And it's quite an experience to be able to do that and realize how much they accomplished with only a fragment of the revelation that we have now, a fragment of the understanding of the priesthood that we have now. That was a whole process that took quite a bit of time to unfold itself to the level of understanding that we have today. They didn't initially use the terms Melchizedek and Aaronic. Those were introduced to explain things they were doing, and when they reached those points, it was like, oh, okay, that's what we've been doing. That's Aaronic, that's Melchizedek, and so on. And they were able to relate those things. But, in 1830, 1831, they're not using that terminology yet. It's not a part of the vocabulary. They don't have that understanding yet. It's this thing of the Lord unfolding things line upon line and precept upon precept. So we look at that and we look at how much it was unfolded and how quickly. It's really remarkable. And then if we think about our time and place, we're still entitled to line upon line and precept upon precept. I mean, on a personal level, all of us have to go through that. Each of us has to continue to learn and grow in the gospel. And we receive things, and things are unfolded to us on an individual basis. If we're doing it right all our life, we'll never stop that process. And the church will never cease continuing to receive line upon line, precept upon precept. So we go back to the very early and watch these things unfold. And it's a powerful witness to the way in which the Lord works with us individually and works with His church.
Thank you both very much for being here. We've been talking today with Mark Staker and Joseph Dorowski. Thank you very much. This has been a very enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.